Here we go. So welcome everyone. This is our spring 2024 5784 semester of Talmud. We call this class a Shiur. Shiur just means a class. And obviously it is heartbreaking to acknowledge that Israel is still at war with Hamas, at war in Gaza. The fact of which prompted me to reformat the content for our fall learning. The intention for the year was to go through the Jewish holiday calendar through the lens of the literature of the Babylonian Talmud. But since the class started right around the attack of October 7th, we pivoted and we spent the fall doing a kind of random assortment of Talmudic passages pertained through various lenses and perspectives to what we were experiencing in the context of the war and the challenges that were being raised attendant to the war across the fall. It is not the hoped for outcome that we could have said the war is over and shalom has returned to the region. Nevertheless, I'd like us to return to our regularly intended course of study. And between now and the end of our spring semester, many weeks from now, we'll be going in sequence through the Jewish holidays. So we're going to do a session today on Purim, the Purim holiday, which was just observed a few days ago. And after we spend some time on Purim today, or today and next week, depending on how much we get done, we'll go straight into Pesach. Pesach will be observed this year starting near the end of April. So we're still 3 weeks and change away from Pesach, which begins on a Monday night. I think it's April 21. So we will study through Pesach and the period known as Omer. The counting of the Omer lasts for 7 weeks between Pesach and Shavuot. So after Pesach, we'll turn our eyes toward the late spring festival of Shavuot. And that should provide us a lot of really interesting material to contemplate. It so happens that the lesson that I've planned for us today, while nominally about Purim and the mitzvot attendant to Purim, is also an invitation to familiarize ourselves, or in the case of those who've been learning over the course of previous months, refamiliarize ourselves with the logic, the methodology, and the mechanics of Talmud. So this will be a good refresher for those who have been kind of acclimated to the admittedly strange way in which Talmud unfolds itself before us as a unique work of literature, unlike what we are familiar with reading in Western literature, really of any kind. I would say Talmud is sui generis in the way it is written, in its internal logic, in the mechanics that are required to decode its meanings. And this will provide, I hope, a really nice refresher and get us kind of like if we're feeling a little rusty, because Talmud, I would say, is not like riding a bike. Talmud is a skill that has to be honed and reinforced through regular practice. And it should be done in community. Studying Talmud alone is not the way the rabbis intended for us to encounter this material. They speak, I would say, affectionately about the value of chavruta, of partnership or pairing, so that at a minimum, Talmud should be studied in a dyad. We're being joined by Dina Rosenthal and Lauren Weiss. Hello. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to acknowledge you, but I'll do that for a moment. Hello, Dina, and hello, Lauren. It's wonderful to have you, Lauren. Welcome back from Israel. So grateful that you were able to travel with the temple last week. And I know from talking with other participants, including you, and with Cantor Kleinman, who ended up leading the trip, that it was an extraordinary experience, powerful, heartbreaking, and inspiring, and often all at once, and exhausting, perhaps above all. Welcome home.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you, Rabbi.
Great to have you. Love the hat, and of course we see your yellow ribbon, which is a reminder of the hostages who are still in Gaza. So thank you for bearing witness to them in this way. Appreciate it. So a couple of mechanical things before we dive into today's selected text, which is one page of Talmud. And those of you who are new to this will realize that one page is actually an ambitious uh, course load for a single session. We probably won't get through even a single page, but we may skip around a little bit. And I might say, okay, that's enough of that topic. Let's move on to the next. Just in terms of how we use the Zoom format to learn together, you are invited to raise an actual hand or more helpfully a digital hand. If you have the newest version of Zoom uploaded onto your computers, sometimes it recognizes that a raised hand in real space, like I'm doing now, translates into a raised hand in digital space. I don't know if you can see, but corresponding to my little Hollywood Squares window, now there is a raised hand, which suggests I want to ask a question. So you can do it with a real hand, or you can use the interface at the foot of the window to acknowledge that you'd like to, raise a question or a comment. And then you can lower your hand similarly. Also, you can use the chat box to add comments, ask questions. I will not get to everyone, but my usual format is to offer a little bit of lecture. Then we go into a text and we take a chunk of text, and I'll provide some context for understanding the text and how we should be reading it. And then we'll open it up to discussion and questions at intervals. But that should not preclude you from asking questions in real time as things occur to you. And if I just can't get to your hand, I'll try and say so, or you can put it in the chat window. And that's Zoom Etiquette 101. When you enter the Zoom, my settings designate you as muted. So you are in charge of unmuting yourself. So before you, even if I call on you and I say, hey, Audrey, I see your hand, please comment here. Please unmute yourself before you comment. I understand that that's something that just takes practice. So let's go right in. I'm going to share on screen a selection from a tractate of Talmud. The Talmud is divided into 6 orders, which are arranged by subject matter. And there's an asterisk next to subject matter because it may not be intuitively obvious or immediately apparent what the subject matter is for any given order. But for instance, case in point, the first order of Talmud is called Zera'im, which means seeds, and is nominally about agricultural practices. But this is the order of Talmud in which the festivals are all explained and examined. The subject of brachot, which is the first tractate of the Talmud in the order Zera'im, which means seeds. What do blessings have to do with seeds? Well, it's all about how Jews or the rabbinic community thought of how we organize time. So I'll do my best to explain why a particular subject is where it is in the Talmud. And in this case, we're going to be looking at a selection from Tractate Megillah. Megillah, as the name suggests, which means scroll, is the one tractate about Purim. So we have a whole tractate about Purim, but it is also the tractate, and tractate just means a kind of like a macro subsection, 6 orders, and then I think at least 6-fold 6. So I think at least 36 tractates, though don't quote me on the exact number. So there's a tractate for Yom Kippur called Yoma. There's a tractate about Rosh Hashanah called Rosh Hashanah. There's a tractate about Sukkot called Sukkah. There's a tractate about Shabbat called Shabbat. And there's a tractate about Purim, not called Purim. It's called Megillah. And that is in part because the signature mitzvah or commandment associated with Purim is to read the Megillah. Megillah means scroll, but in kind of like colloquial Jewish parlance, Megillah refers to specifically Megillat Esther, the Megillah of Esther, or the Scroll of Esther. There are other books of the Hebrew Bible called Megillot or Megillas. Song of Songs, the great love poem or even erotic poem of the Bible, is a Megillah. The book of Ruth is a Megillah. The book of Jonah is a Megillah. So the book of Kohelet or Ecclesiastes, also a Megillah. And some of these are going to come up in today's conversation. Um, the Tractate Megillah takes up not only, therefore, the mitzvot pertaining to Purim, but also all of the regulations pertaining to the public reading of Torah. So if you want to know how Torah scrolls are written and read in the Jewish tradition, you go to the Talmud, Tractate Megillah. I specified at the outset of our conversation this morning that we are studying Babylonian Talmud. I say so because there are actually two Talmuds. There is the greater of the Talmuds, both in size and in renown, which is the Babylonian Talmud, composed, as the title indicates, in Babylonia, which was the largest community of Jewish exiles in, I would say, antiquity, but I have to be careful about what we mean by antiquity. So again, in the Common Era, the Jewish community in Babylonia was incredibly sizable and important and intellectually flourishing. There was an exilic community of Jews or Judeans who ended up in Babylonia much, much earlier, 6 centuries before Jesus ever walked the earth. Jews were exiled from their home in Judah, in the southern part of what today is Israel, the land of Israel. And this is the famous period known as, or the infamous period known as the Babylonian exile, at the conquest of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia. That establishes a Jewish community in Babylonia from very, very early in Jewish history. And so you probably have Jews living in Babylonia for, the better part of 2,600 years or so. Though the last of Iraq's Jews, Iraq being the territory of ancient Babylonia, modern day Iraq, the last of Iraq's Jews, there are very, very few Jews left in Baghdad. Most of them left in the 40s and 50s. As is the case with most Jews from Arab lands, most of them went to Israel or were violently expelled or killed. So when I say you have 2,600 years of consistent Jewish presence in Babylonia, not so much today. Okay, the lesser of the Talmuds, both in size and renown, is the so-called Palestinian Talmud, because it was written in the territory known as Palestine, which is a Roman province. And sometimes it's called the Jerusalem Talmud, even though it was not written in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a euphemism for the Talmud that was composed in Eretz Yisrael, in the land of Israel. We will probably not refer to the Palestinian or the Jerusalem Talmud at all. So when I say Talmud, I mean the Babylonian Talmud. Tractate Megillah, Daf 7. So a daf just means a page, and every page of Talmud has an A side and a B side. You just flip it over. On one side is A, on the other side is B. And we're looking near the top, but not exactly at the top of Tractate Megillah. Okay, now, full disclosure, brand new laptop. First week using it, I've had it for a day. I'm a little bit concerned that I want to share my screen, but it doesn't seem to be letting me right off the bat. So give me 1 second. Share screen. Google Chrome. All right. Oh, I have to allow Zoom to share my screen. I have to set up a preference. Okay, hang on. 1 moment, please. Oh, no. Let's see. It's telling me I might have to restart Zoom. That would be unfortunate. Let's see what happens here. How does that look? Can everyone see the text? Great. Joe
Yes.
just joined us. Great. Now, the only other thing I'm concerned about is, are we actually recording this Zoom? Yes, it says I am screen sharing and it says I'm recording. Okay, good. I also had to update my Zoom client this morning. All right, so we are going to begin with what the Talmud teaches us about how Purim came to be a holiday. You may say, huh, that's interesting. Didn't it just kind of happen? And what we learned from this is no. As a matter of fact, there is some dispute over whether or not Purim should have been a holiday at all. And we are going to talk in quite some depth and detail about the sanctity of the book of Esther. So I just want you to kind of like put a thumbtack in my opening dilemma that I've provided for us, which is, what is the problem with Purim as a holiday? And what is the challenge around canonizing the book of Esther as scripture, as holy writ? And we're going to talk a lot about what makes a book holy or not holy, or I might say less holy or not fully holy. And it seems as if the rabbis are attuned to a particular challenge around the book of Esther um, that will emerge in, as I said, great depth and detail. And this is intended to be a lesson that operates on two levels. One, there's the content of the lesson itself. We are going to learn about Purim. We're going to learn about the book of Esther. But we're also going to have a very helpful kind of like mini course on Talmudic logic and Talmudic mechanics, which are really bizarre unless you've been acclimated. And then it's like, oh, okay, I've been swimming in this water. It starts to feel more comfortable. But please don't hesitate to ask questions, because I expect that some of this will leave you a little bit jumbled mentally. Talmud does that. Okay, Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. We begin with this statement, and I am going to do what I can to bring to life the Hebrew and Aramaic text of the Talmud. Talmud being written in two different languages, Hebrew, for the older strata of Talmud. Remember, Talmud being a composite work compiled through conversations of rabbis, starting with reciters and then elaborated by discussers over the course of 7 or 8 centuries. The earlier text of the Talmud is generally in the Hebrew language, with some loanwords from Aramaic and Greek and Latin. And the later strata of Talmud are in Aramaic, which became the vernacular of the ancient Near East and the Jewish people in particular, and was the language of doing business and commerce and transactions and whatnot. It was not necessarily a sacred language, but now, because it really is the language of the Babylonian Talmud, it takes on a sanctified kind of, it becomes holy through the way in which it is used in the Talmud. Okay, Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda. Rabbi Shmuel, son of Yehuda, said, Shalcha lahem Esther lahachamim. Esther sent out a word. Shalcha means she sent. Esther, this is Esther, lahachamim, to the sages. Esther said to the sages, Kiv'uni lidorot, which literally means fix me, or not fix in the sense of repair, but fix in the sense of establish. Establish me for the generations, like Lidor Vador, hallelujah, Dorot. So Kiv'uni Lidorot. I want my name or my story established for all time. So the rabbis are, did this actually happen? Who knows? Generally, the answer when studying Talmud is no, and it doesn't matter. A lot of this is the work of rabbinic imagination. So the rabbis are retrojecting themselves back into the time of Esther, asking the question implicitly, how did Purim get to be a holiday? Right? That's where we're starting. And Rabbi Shmuel Bar Yehuda says, here's what happened. Esther sent out a message to the sages. Who are the sages? We don't know, except it is interesting that the word for sage is chachamim, like a chacham. You ever hear of a chacham or a talmid chacham, which means a wise person or a wise student? The chachamim, were they kind of like the wise elders of Persia of her day? Perhaps, but it is intriguing to note that the word chachamim also means rabbis. So when the rabbis are using these words, sometimes they are playing with double entendre here, right? So the rabbis are saying, Esther said to the chachamim, but they might mean, this is how we, the rabbis, understand our own authority in the long chain of Jewish tradition. It is as if the rabbis are saying, we have an indirect missive from Miss Esther herself, Queen Esther, told our predecessor, wise folks, establish me for all generations. Shalchula. They reported back to her, Kin'a at me'oreret aleinu levein ha'uma. Ha'umot. Okay, so what this means here, and as you can see, when we're looking at the translation, very helpfully provided through the Koren Publishing Company, and it's the Adin Steinsaltz translation. I don't know if you can see where I'm trying to highlight here. The William Davidson Talmud. I don't know who Bill Davidson is, but he probably gave a lot of money to have his Talmud published online through Sefaria, the incredible online Jewish directory of all sacred and not so sacred text. So they said back to her, you will arouse the wrath of the nations upon us. Okay, so, and again, the word for wrath here is not actually the word wrath. This is the word kina. It means you will make the other nations jealous. Kina at me'oreret. You will arouse jealousy over us, leveina umot, among all the other nations. So what the rabbis said back, or the chachamim, the sages said back to Esther is, I don't know. If we promote your story far and wide, Esther, it's going to piss off a lot of the other nations. Why would the story of Esther do that? I just stopped sharing deliberately, so you can see my face and not just the text. Well, what's the story of Esther about, after all? Right? It is about a genocidal opponent of the Jewish people who is highly paranoid and influential and close to King Ahasuerus, who seems to be an easily manipulated stooge. This genocidal maniac, the villain of the Purim story, goes by the name Haman. You can stomp and boo in your own house, and I don't need to hear it because you're still muted. But every time I say Haman, you can boo or shake your grogger. Haman wants to do away with all the Jews. Of course, his plot is foiled by the wily Queen Esther and her bravery and the insight of her ward, or her guardian, I should say. Esther is the ward of her guardian, whose name is Mordecai. The text identifies him variously as a cousin or maybe an uncle. So some like close male relative of hers says, hey, you're in the position to do something about this. We've got a problem here in the court of Shushan. You better go do something. And she has a party thrown, and she informs the king, even at the peril of her own life, that the life of all the Jews in the kingdom is in danger. And of course, Ahasuerus is mortified hearing this and decides to rescind the genocidal edict that Haman had selected against the Jews, choosing a date by lottery, the word for lottery being Purim, or Pur in the singular. And that date instead becomes a day where the Jews are saved, and Haman and his 10 sons are hanged or impaled, depending on your translation. And hooray, let's eat. Okay, now that's a wonderful story for the Jewish people, but maybe the sages are saying, maybe we don't want to promote that far and wide among the Gentiles. And this might not be, as the saying always goes, good for the Jews, right? Is it good for the Jews? That's the only lens through which Jewish people tend to evaluate events. Is it good for the Jews? These sages are saying back to Esther, I hear you. I know that your story is really impressive, but maybe we should just keep it amongst ourselves. Maybe we should keep it on the DL, right? All right, that seems to be the basic argument here. But of course, we know that Purim becomes a holiday. So let's keep reading. Shalcha lahem, she sent word back to them. Kvar kituvani al divrei hayamim lemalchei madai ufaras. So she's saying, it's already written. I am already written into the words of the book of Chronicles, which is already canonized in the Bible. The way the rabbis of the Talmud understand this, Esther is retorting as if she has knowledge of the TaNaKh, as if she has knowledge of canonized Hebrew scripture, saying, what's the big deal here if I have a book all to myself? I want a book of Esther. I'm already mentioned in other books of the Torah and in the chronicles of the kings of Media and Paras, or Persia. You know, she's saying, no, there's no worry here. Like, if you're anxious about my story being told among the Gentiles who are not going to find favor with this and who may act out against the Jews, well, too late. It's already a fait accompli, right? And you can see in the translation, again, the Steinsaltz translation interpolates the text for us. It provides us translation and commentary all together interlinearly. So Boldface is what the Talmud actually says. Sorry, I'm trying to highlight here. Boldface, like this, is actually in the text. Plain type, if you can see the difference, is not in the text. It's Steinsaltz's interpolation or gloss on the text. So she sent back to them, already written in the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia, and so the Megillah will not publicize anything that is not already known worldwide. So she's trying to allay their anxieties and saying, look, not a big deal. I'm already well known. So according to this tradition in the Talmud, the holiday of Purim and the book of Esther specifically begins directly with Queen Esther herself, with a request or a plea to the wise Jewish folk of her time and place, memorialize my story, please. They push back and say this could be bad for the Jews. She says, too late. I'm already known. I should have this, and therefore I should have a holiday for me. I guess when you're queen, you get to do that. Okay. Any questions thus far on anything we've studied? Especially for the newcomers to our class, please do not be bashful if I am moving too fast, or if you'd like a little more background to help you through, please don't be bashful, and you can say so right here and right now. I see a couple things in the chat, by the way. Rabbi, I'll have to log in. Okay, that's fine. It brings to mind the way Hanukkah is manipulated in the Talmud trope. Yes, yes, indeed. The Talmud, of course, gets to say what the holidays are, how they came to be, and what they mean. What we know is that, of course, the biblical holidays originate probably before, well, certainly before the Torah was ever written. So when we get to Pesach, we'll spend some time exploring the origins of Pesach. And you may be surprised to learn that a lot of the origins of Pesach are pagan agricultural festivals pertaining to the birthing of new lambs and the feast of unleavened grain, all of which existed before there were ever people who walked the earth who thought of themselves as Jewish or even Israelites. So is this real history? No, but it is our story. And the rabbis claim ownership of the tradition, so much so that the way we practice as Jews today is through the rabbinic mindset and lens, right? So we are not biblical Jews. Case in point. On Pesach, nobody in the Scarsdale or Westchester Jewish community that I know is going to go into your backyard and slaughter a lamb, right? But that's what the Torah tells us to do on Pesach. We do Pesach the way the rabbis of the Talmud told us to do it, which is to have a thing called a Seder. And we do that. In fact, definitively, we do not slaughter lambs in our backyard. In fact, Ashkenazi Jews, by custom, if not by law, do not serve lamb at their Seder. We'll get into why that is several weeks from now. Okay, Judy Gross, I saw your hand first, please. Unmute.
So the idea of a woman being so impactful and so strong is not normal in our tradition and our literature. Certainly they were there, but we don't know about that. She has an amazing chutzpah to do what she did, to be the heroine of her story. And now she's even stronger. She comes out even stronger. Hey, not only was I great, but I want everyone to know. So there's a lot of pride in there. That maybe is not the most desirable characteristic.
I love your attentiveness to that. And I would say unusual, though not unique. There is another book of the Bible named for a woman. That is the book of Ruth. And there are other heroines, including military heroines such as Deborah and Yael, all of whom are, canonized in the TaNaKh. Nevertheless, I think Esther does occupy a uniquely prominent role in Jewish memory, and the rabbis are highlighting that for us. Clearly, their comfort level with imagining an Esther who would have the chutzpah, as you say, to request a book in her name and a holiday in her memory, is noteworthy, and I love that you pointed it out. Deborah. There you go.
Two quick things. First was, I just want to clarify, I apologize. The Book of Chronicles was, in fact, written with her at this point, or?
Well, at this point is a little bit tricky. We don't know when the Book of Esther exactly was written, though best guess is somewhere between the fifth and the third centuries BCE. And we know that the final canonization of the TaNaKh happens sometime in the 2nd century BCE because it includes the book of Daniel, which is the last book to be written. We're going chronologically. Do not read into the sequence in which the books appear in the Hebrew Bible as an indication of chronology of composition. That is not the case. Genesis was not necessarily written before Exodus. And in fact, the books were not written wholesale. Each of the books of the TaNaKh is probably a composite work itself. Having said that, was the book of Chronicles, which is generally dated very late in the chronology of composition, included at the time that Esther was around? Probably not. No one knows. But certainly all of these books were canonized by the time the rabbis of the Talmud were writing, because the Talmud was written in the Common Era, right? The Talmud was written in CE time, not BCE. And therefore, the rabbis have access to all of the canonized scripture, more or less the same way we have it today, asterisk. There are many citations in the Talmud of specific verses and words and passages in the Torah that may be slightly off from what we have in our scripture today because of different scribal traditions. We would call them scribos, not typos. And clearly variants existed for many centuries and were not really fully extirpated, these variants, in favor of a single authoritative canonized version of the Talmud, of the TaNaKh, rather, the Hebrew Bible, where every letter is identical until around the eighth or the ninth centuries. So, the rabbis are retrojecting back onto the figure of Esther herself the knowledge of other books of the Bible that they had access to, but she would not have. Okay, Dave and Karen.
Hi, I want to focus on one of the two questions you thought we should focus on, meaning, is the Megillah somehow less holy? And so with respect to that question, well, first of all, you told us, and we agreed, that God is not mentioned in this book.
When Karen says, I told you, I didn't tell you that yet today. But Karen and Dave got a little bit of a preview at Saturday morning Sharing Shabbat Adult Study, where they participate regularly. And I happen to have covered the 9th chapter of the Book of Esther. And I said, by the way, Book of Esther is the only book of the Hebrew Bible that does not mention God. So thank you for raising that. That is a bullseye comment for the context of today's conversation.
But that's actually, I wasn't that good. I was wanting to focus on another question, revealing that I don't know text so well, story structure. How does the story structure of this book compare with that of others? It feels like this is a real story, and really, in a way, such a narrative that it just feels different to read than almost any other section. But I don't have that experience too. Am I saying the right thing or not?
I certainly am with you in that, just at the level of gut feeling or impression as a reader, Esther stands out for a number of different reasons, though I would not have said structurally. I've never really done a structural analysis of the Book of Esther. There are some curious structural features of the book. The fact of the matter is, it begins with a party. There's a party in the middle, and there's a party toward the end. And it's often not clear why we need 3 parties. Why is Ahasuerus just the kind of king who has nothing better to do with his time and his money than throw parties? Clearly, some of this is about characterizing Ahasuerus as a kind of rich doofus who has no scruples and likes to show off how rich he is, and likes to throw parties where the point of the party is everyone gets drunk. I would also say, we can make some comments on the interesting or even unique features of the Book of Esther from a standpoint of genre criticism. Again, not structure, but genre. Esther may be unique among biblical literature in that many believe it is intentionally written to be a farce. It is intentionally satirical. It is intentionally here to make you laugh. And in keeping with that, we might get to a few comments from the rabbis today that are consistent with the tone or genre of Esther. So my comments aren't intended so much as a correction, but as a yes and. with what you're saying, Karen. I'm not sure that Esther is structurally unique, but it certainly comes across as different. And the absence of God from the book, the farcical elements, the strange features of parties. There's a lot of sexual double entendre in the book of Esther. I mean, Vashti is asked to quote unquote dance. Esther is selected at a quote unquote beauty contest. The king selects Esther for his throne, which you should read as a harem, by dint of extending his golden scepter. I mean, if you look at sometimes a cigar definitely is not a cigar. So, okay, let's, Dick, comment.
So being that this is my first class, I do feel as if I dove right into the deep end. So I may be way off base here, but I can't help but at least visualize some parallels to modern day here in that we talk about Haman, and of course we're dealing with Hamas. The book talks about world opinion. There's a concern about world opinion. Israel finds itself in that same situation right now. And, I don't know if I'm way off base, but I just can't help but
I don't know if this is a phrase. It sounds more like a baseball thing, but you are so on base. Yeah. And so some of this I observed when I was contemplating, should we just skip over Purim and go right into Pesach because it's such a treasure trove? And, the Tractate Megillah in the Babylonian Talmud is relatively short, relatively. It's only 30 some pages, which is still big. Like a page of Talmud is actually pages and pages of English translation. And Pesachim is like 120 some or 140 some odd pages. But I said, no, this is too apropos. How can we overlook the way in which the story of Purim and the commentary on the story of Purim is a kind of meta comment on where we are in Jewish time, Jewish history right now. So absolutely. And when I say things like, I even pointed this out, I think Achashverosh is a particularly Trumpian figure. Obviously, that is the definition of anachronism. But I am not above or perhaps beneath making sense of our ancient texts in light of modern events. So thanks, Dick. You're with us, Anne. And then we'll proceed.
Speaking of all the partying, we're supposed to get drunk on Purim. We are supposed to get so drunk that we don't know the difference between blessed be Mordechai and cursed be Haman, which is interesting.
Hold that thought. Hold that thought. It's actually in today's text. Okay, great. Okay, let's return to the text, and because we have a lot to do. I'm moving us forward now. This is the part about Esther. I'm going to skip a little bit. And this is still about Esther's request to have her story memorialized. And now we're going to pick up with another statement by Rav Yehuda, who is quoting Shmuel. All right, so I'm picking up right here. I don't know, you can see, sometimes I use the highlighter and it fouls up the presentation of the text, but this is the one line that I'm looking at. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. Also, by the way, for newbies, very, very commonplace for the Talmud to quote its sources in this kind of recursive way. One rabbi said that another rabbi said, and sometimes it goes 3 or 4 layers deep. One rabbi said that his teacher said that another rabbi said that this rabbi taught that goes back to a tradition ascribed to such and so rabbi. This is really a values statement. It's not just a stylistic quirk or fetish of the ancient rabbis to quote their sources. It really, I think, gives testimony to the Jewish value of citing your sources. Right? God forbid we should have some wise comment attributed to ourselves when in fact proper attribution ought to be given to one's master or one's master's master. So in this case, Rav Yehuda said that the following statement is attributed to Shmuel. Esther einam mitama'a et hayadayim. All right. Now, again, just the text itself. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said, the book of Esther does not render your hands ritually impure. Okay, we're going to get into some weird weeds here. The subject that's being discussed is the idea that a scroll, and remember the word Megillah literally means a scroll, comes from the root word legalgel. So you can hear Megillah, the Gimel Lamed root, or Gimel Lamed Lamed, Galal, means to roll. And in fact, a wave of the ocean is called a gal. So many of you know the talented and beautiful Israeli superstar actor Gal Gadot. By the way, the T is pronounced. It's not French, it's Hebrew. Gal Gadot. She played Wonder Woman in the more recent movies. Gal is a popular Israeli name for both males and females, I think, but it's a unisex name, more popular for women. It means a wave, like a wave of the ocean. So gal is something that rolls, or that rolls over and over. And a Megillah is a scroll, right? You unroll it and you roll it back up. So the word sefer, which means to recount, which also means a book, is another word for a scroll. Because remember, they didn't have books that were bound this way in antiquity, right? It was all scrolls. So the idea is that a parchment scroll, according to rabbinic teaching, you might say superstition, actually contaminates a person. This is not about schmutz. This is not about you being dirty or unclean or cast out. It simply means that you have to be very careful and you should not touch a sacred scroll because it ritually contaminates you. Now, I did a little bit of research into this over the last several days, and I came up with nothing conclusive in the scholarly literature about why this is so. Other than the fact that it is well attested in the rabbinic literature, there's this idea that touching a scroll renders your hands impure. And there's going to be an asterisk by that. I use the kind of like asterisk term to mean I have a qualifying or a disclaiming comment coming up. But that's the idea. Don't touch a scroll because it renders your hands ritually impure, or just know that certain scrolls are so holy that they contaminate you. You might think it should go the other way. Touching a holy scroll should actually impart holiness. But it seems as if the holiness of the object itself is associated with what anthropologists would call taboo, right? Something that is restricted for reasons that are trans-rational or even irrational. Because we're not going to come up with a logical explanation for why. All we know is that there's this widespread, deeply embedded in rabbinic thought, Jewish notion that scrolls confer ritual contamination upon the one who touches them. Now, and again, asterisk. We'll get to the asterisk in a minute. What's the disclaimer there? The disclaimer is around which scrolls exactly. Some scrolls do, and some scrolls don't. But I found some Talmudic folklore, and don't ask me to quote chapter and verse. It's elsewhere in the Talmud. It might be in Tractate Eruvin. I'll look it up. Doesn't matter for now. There's a folk explanation for why this is so. And it's cute. Okay, so the idea is that ancient Jewish people used to have to bring food or trumot, which means a gift, for the Kohanim, for the priests, right? They would have to bring sacrificial gifts of pastry or bread or meat, whatever, vegetables, specifically as a sacrificial offering to feed the priests. Right? The priests got to eat too. And unlike the other tribes of Israel, the Kohanim and the Levites don't have land that they can tend. And so they were not an agricultural tribe. They were a tribe of priests who relied on the donations of the people to feed themselves and their households. So the tradition, the folk tradition goes that the ancient Jews would take their trumot, would take their gifts for the priests, their food, and wrap it in holy scrolls. Why? That way, the holiness of the food would remain untouched, right? You wrap something holy in something else holy, and then there's no threat of contamination. If the food can't be contaminated, God forbid it should come into contact with a contaminant. What's a contaminant? A non-kosher animal. A gecko walks along, like a little desert lizard, and starts to, eat your food. Oh no, now all of this nice food that I made a basket for the priest, he can't accept it. Or it, God forbid, came into contact with a dead body. That would be a ritual contaminant, or blood, or semen, or anything else that the rabbis indicated, and there's several tractates of the Talmud about this, indicated as a ritual contaminant. Okay, so problem solved. We'll take our holy scrolls and we'll wrap the food in the holy parchment. And then we'll unroll it, and we have a nice copy of a Megillah that we can carry with us, still holy, and bring the uncontaminated food to the priest. What's the problem? The tradition goes that mice got into the food. And not only would they eat the food and contaminate the food, they would, by proxy, contaminate the scroll. So the workaround is that the rabbis declared that every scroll that contains the name of God, or just any scroll that is holy, is already contaminated. And therefore, you can't wrap your gifts for the priest in it. This is Talmudic logic. It's completely bonkers. I see Anne going like this. Right. Well, I share your impression that this is a little bit zany. But okay, so one way, either through, this is a folk explanation. I don't think it actually explains the origin of the custom or the tradition that holy scrolls contaminate the handler. But that is the tradition. Okay, this definitely prompted a few comments. Mom and Dad, and then Audrey.
This is worse than keeping surgical sterile protocol in the operating room.
Right. Oh, you want to say a further word about that? I know this from experience because thanks to a little bit of nepotism back when I was a college student, I worked as an operating room aide in an operating theater in Allentown where I was raised. And I had to handle all of the sterile equipment and make sure that it was sterile. So, but when you talk about sterile fields in an operating room, can you just say one sentence more that would clarify your meaning?
Well, there's a hard barrier, or supposedly in the operating room, between what you can touch and how you can touch it. You can't touch a sterile instrument unless you're wearing sterile gloves. Things are sterilized in autoclaves and then shrink wrapped in envelopes or in packages, but the only way to get the sterile instrument out is somebody who is not sterile carefully opening the package and dumping the instrument out onto a sterile field.
Right.
I mean,
so at some level, the rules and why a 6-minute scrub and not 5 and not 7, all of these were, of course, intended, to minimize or prevent altogether the transmission of germs, but they do strike the casual observer as somewhat arbitrary and selective. Right? Why? You can't drop your hands below the level of your waist because now they're not sterile. Presumably. Those are the rules of the operating theater. I like the analogy very much. Audrey.
I was actually quite surprised by this because I would have.
Oh, I muted you by accident. I'm so sorry. I was trying to lower your hand. Start over. My bad. Totally my bad.
I was a little sort of taken aback by this because I would have thought the opposite, that a mere mortal would contaminate the scroll.
You would think the opposite. And yet the tradition persists. Like I said, it defies logic. It is irrational. And yet the rabbis try and come up with this rational explanation through the folk explanation of the scrolls and the mice and everything. Okay, so reading on. So now we're going to get into a really interesting discussion about the book of Esther specifically. And this is where we get to my asterisk, right? Oh, just keep yourself muted, please. All right, here we go. All right, so Lememra de Savar Shmuel Esther Lav Beruach HaKodesh Ne'emra. So this is the question. The Talmud often speaks in rhetorical questions, another feature of Talmudic style. Is this to say, Lememra, does this mean Disavar Shmuel, that Shmuel reasons or here they say maintains, that Shmuel reasons or maintains Esther Lav Beruach HaKodesh Ne'emra, that the book of Esther was not conveyed or not stated through divine inspiration. And the phrase here is Ruach HaKodesh. Ruach meaning breath or wind, but also spirit or inspiration. Kodesh, probably a familiar word even to, laymen, meaning holiness. So Beruach HaKodesh literally means divine inspiration or the divine spirit. So are you saying that the book of Esther was not divinely inspired? That's what Shmuel is saying. Because remember, the conjecture is that the book of Esther does not contaminate the handler. Therefore, according to the logic that we've just spent several minutes establishing, if it doesn't contaminate you, it must not be a holy book. And Shmuel can't believe what he's hearing. He's saying, wait a minute, are you saying that the book of Esther was not divinely inspired? I just want to pause here and kind of like zoom the lens out for a moment to interject a comment. My comment. This is like Blake's comment. I find it astonishing that you have ancient rabbis even arguing over this. Like the fact that the rabbis are actually debating whether or not a book that was part of their canonized scripture is actually divinely inspired is a fascinating comment. You might think only Reformed Jews starting in the 1800s had conversations like this as a function of their exposure to the German Academy and the academic study of Bible as literature and Judaism and other religions as history. Right? That all started in the 19th century, even a little bit earlier. That's like Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment phenomena. Here you have something ancient literature, and the rabbis are arguing, wait a minute, did you just say that it's possible that a book of our Bible was not divinely inspired? That's where this is going. And again, that's why I think, Karen, your comment earlier, that you observed what I shared with the community of sharing Shabbat on Saturday morning, that this is the only book of the Bible that doesn't mention God, even though that doesn't come up in this Talmudic passage, is hovering in the background the whole time, right? This is the one book of the Bible that doesn't include God's name. So its status as divinely inspired may be, in fact, up for debate, which is exactly what it is. Okay, let's read on. I'll just read on in the English. But didn't Shmuel himself say elsewhere that the book of Esther was stated with the inspiration of the divine spirit? It's a little bit wordy. I would just say divinely inspired, right? Wait a minute. Shmuel, this same rabbi, appears to have made two contradictory statements. One, it is divinely inspired, one that it's not. The Gemara, which is just the Aramaic word for the Talmud itself, the Talmud itself responds to this question. It was stated with the divine spirit that it is to be read in public. However, it was not stated that it is to be written. In other words, the book was divinely inspired for the purpose of public reading. But the minute you write it down, you've got a problem. It was never God's intention to memorialize this scroll. And again, they don't say so, but it appears that one possible reason for rabbinic discomfort here around the book of Esther is the fact that God's not in it. Modern scholars, by the way, believe that God was in the book and then systematically removed. Why? No one knows, though possibly because the book itself is so problematic. It's racy, it's satirical, and if you read the 9th chapter of the book of Esther, it is the most morally problematic of all biblical books. Most people don't know this. This is what I talked about Saturday morning with our Sharing Shabbat adult community. But the book of Esther actually describes how after the Jews were liberated from Haman's evil decree, do you guys know what happened? Dad, what happened?
I think they murdered 30,000 Shushanites.
Oh, you're so far off. It's 75,000.
Oh, 75.
So they go out and kill a few hundred Shushanites. And then then Esther comes to Achashverosh and says, that was a good start. Can we do that again the next day? Which is why Purim is observed for 2 days in Shushan, by the way, and other walled biblical communities. That's why there's a second day of Purim called Shushan Purim. But last time I checked, Scarsdale doesn't have a wall around it, so we don't observe 2 days of Purim in Scarsdale. And she said, let's kill some more. And then the Jews went out and murdered 75,000 Persians. Genocide. Like they just went crazy. So for a lot of different reasons, the rabbis have this tradition that it was divinely inspired for the purpose of reciting it. You can tell the story, but maybe we shouldn't write this down and especially not ascribe it to God. Russell.
I have two thoughts. Is it any coincidence that, unless I'm mistaken, Purim is the only holiday that celebrates assimilation?
Wow.
To my thinking, all of the others, including Hanukkah, are celebrating Jews as an isolated community, but this is celebrating the triumph of the Jewish people as an assimilated people in Persia or some other fictitious environment. And
that's fascinating.
And therefore questions whether or not this is divinely inspired. But I also have.
And by the way, your comment about assimilation, Purim is also the one holiday where Jews are invited to put on masks and costumes, which many have commented before is a comment on the Jew's ability to disguise himself or herself in the company of the non-Jew. Go on.
So anyhow, it's just conjecture. But the second analysis I have of this is that when it was talking about clean versus unclean, contamination, all of those things, so many religions, probably all of them, have some concept of what it means to be clean or unclean, pure or unpure. And as I think about it, that's really probably the most difficult question about the intersection between the physical world and the world of the spirit. Mm-hmm. The physical world is inherently dirty. Turns out the spiritual world is inherently dirty also. And we have to make choices that, cleanse ourselves spiritually as well. With all of the strictures and the contradictions and the seeming arbitrariness of what it means to be pure, is it really highlighting and then even questioning not whether or not God wants this? Is this in effect an admission that the physical world is always going to be a mere approximation of what we really are aspiring to? I would say these laws are in fact a distraction from what we really should be aspiring to, which is some kind of interior or spiritual purity.
Love the observation. We'll just let it sit there. I think that your lens is consistent with how anthropologists read these literatures too, by the way. And the most famous example of this is the book that was published, I think, in 1960 by the groundbreaking anthropologist Mary Douglas, who wrote a book called Purity and Danger, which explains Leviticus, the third book of the Torah, in very similar terms, and the kind of the uncomfortable collision between the aspiration to inhabit the spiritual, which is pure or not, and the muck and chaos and mess and contamination that is an inherent feature and function of living in the material world, in the world of bodies and decomposition and bodily fluids and mess. Beautiful. There's several comments. I want to I see a couple hands up, and I also was invited to look at Judy S., who has had a physical hand up. Or is that Judy Lass? Okay, so Judy Lass has her actual hand up. So you can unmute yourself, please, first.
It is Judy Starts Lass. It came
Judy
on
Starts. Got it. That's the S.
Yes. My question is, when I was listening to this, is there not the idea of the red heifer, where once again you are to purify with the red heifer and then you get contaminated because
exactly. And that's not Leviticus. That's the book of Numbers, chapter 19. It's actually going to be read as part of next week's standard selection of readings. Yep, it's how do you get rid of the ritual contamination that is conferred upon a person who accidentally or deliberately has contact with a corpse? The Bible has an answer for that. You take a heifer that is pure red, not a single blemish, not a single white or brown spot on it, and you slaughter the calf, you burn it and its hide and all of its entrails, and you turn the ash and you make a potion out of it, and then you sprinkle the potion all over the person who was contaminated, and hooray, they're no longer contaminated. The Bible says this. The rabbis go in and look at this passage and say, interesting, such a thing never happened. The rabbis say this is one of the examples of something the Bible talks about that never actually could have existed. And to this day, there are some Jewish religious nut jobs living in and around the Holy Land who are trying to breed a purely red heifer as part of their desire to push the days of the Messiah to the present moment. Because if only the Messiah would come, you could have a purely red heifer, and you could rebuild the temple, and you could reinstitute the biblical priesthood. And I'll just say privately, I sometimes offer a prayer that such outcomes will not eventuate. Okay. Thank you, Barbara.
I don't remember correctly. Once the Jews were able to defend themselves, and the notices went out to all of the provinces that the Jews can defend themselves, were they allowed to take the spoils, or they weren't?
No, and that's one of the things that the book of Esther insists throughout the 9th chapter, that in all of their rampaging and killing, they did not lay hands on the spoil. Because again,
were they allowed to? Or they weren't? Or they just didn't?
It's not clear because God's not in the book, right? So you don't have any commandments. But there's an inference that they saw this as a holy war. Yeah. Forgive me, but they saw it as what we call cherem in biblical language, which, for lack of a better way of putting it, is basically a jihad. It's a divinely commanded war of annihilation. But you can't take the spoil because the spoil is consecrated to God and therefore contaminates the handler. Same idea, by the way.
But when they were allowed to kill the Jews, they were allowed to take the spoil.
You mean kill the Persians?
No. When the Persians were commanded to kill the Jews on Haman's day, they were allowed to take the spoils.
I guess so, but they answer to a different authority, do they not?
Right.
Okay. Deb.
Just very quick. You mentioned, or we all know, that God is not present in this book. It also seems to be missing that, as an extension, that Esther didn't do the obligatory pray to God for strength for her people, for success in the name of God. Like, this is a person acting on their own effort, and no one seems to find that troubling in this tractate.
That's a yes and, because if you look at the 4th chapter of the book of Esther, which is where Esther discovers, or Esther learns from Mordecai her calling to save the Jews, it does say that she fasted and put on sackcloth and ashes, and a ritual fast in Esther's memory, or Esther's mold, called Ta'anit Esther, which means the fast of Esther, is still observed 3 days before Purim. In traditional Jewish communities. You may have Orthodox friends who, it's not a full Yom Kippur 25-hour fast. It's not an overnight fast. It's a sun-up to sundown fast, kind of like the fast of each day of Ramadan in the Muslim calendar. So the rabbis interpolate that this was her moment of prayer to God for the strength to stand up for the Jews, even at peril of her own life. You're right, though. I mean, this is one of the functions and features of the book of Esther, is that God and the trappings of Jewish religion or Israelite religion that are so commonplace in every other book of the Torah, in every other book of the Bible, are just missing from this book, leading most academics to conclude, by the way, that God was there and then pulled out, as opposed to was not there in the first place. Audrey, and then we'll do one more section, and clearly we're coming back to Purim next week, and gratefully so.
When you and your father talked about the extermination of so many of the Shushanites after they went after Haman, of course, that brings us to the present day and what the world thinks.
Right.
But there's no recorded backlash or
Well, this is what I talked about on Saturday morning, and I didn't want to go too deep into it today, but if you study the 9th chapter of the book of Esther and are not disconcerted by it, then I think that you might need to work on your moral sensitivity. It is not easily just shaken off. And so we had a very, I think, deep and challenging conversation about, can a religious community or can any community indulge genocidal fantasies, not acting on them? Just is there a place for the role of fantasy literature where, because there's no evidence that the Jews actually went and did. Look, there's no evidence for the Purim story altogether. Like many stories in the TaNaKh, there's just no evidence. When I say there's no evidence, that means the TaNaKh is itself its only witness. There's no extra textual evidence, meaning there's not another book that tells you, and this happened that way. The Exodus is a great example. It's a really important part of the Jewish story. So you would think for 400 years of Israelite slavery in Egypt that there will be one Egyptian record, one piece of ceramic or stone that had something pertaining to Israelites. There's not. There's one. There's one stele. There's one like plaster-coated artifact that was found somewhere in Egyptologists found this thing that said Israel is utterly or Jacob is utterly vanquished. All right, but that could be a record of a battle. Like, we don't know what that means. There's just no evidence, and there's no archaeological evidence either. You would think that 600,000 Israelite warriors tromping through the desert for 40 years and then forcibly conquering the Canaanites would leave behind a piece of pottery that archaeologists could trace to that sequence of very detailed biblical events. But that doesn't exist either. Okay, so yeah, significant contrast with Hanukkah again, because there's lots of archaeological evidence and extra-textual evidence for the Hanukkah story. Fascinating, because Hanukkah is kind of a minor holiday and Pesach is kind of a big deal. We are the stories we tell about ourselves. If you're joining us for the first time, then hooray, you're hearing that for the first time from me and it feels fresh. To everyone else who's been studying with me for a long time, you've probably heard it 100 times. Okay, we have a little bit more to do. We end at 11:45. So here we go back into the text. So they have this debate over whether it was divinely inspired or not. And here's a really interesting, we're just going to go into the English. The Gemara raises an objection, and you can see Steinsaltz tells us the objection comes from a baraita. A baraita means an extra Talmudic, speaking of extra textual evidence, baraitot, or a baraita, is a compilation of rabbinic literature that for reasons we don't fully understand were not included in the final Talmud, but clearly were kept as a kind of supplemental record from the Mishnaic period, which is the earliest, the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, from like 0 or slightly before 0, the days of Hillel and Shammai is the 1st century before the year 0, before Jesus. From about 0 to 235 CE. So the first third of the 3rd century of the Common Era. You have these literatures. One gets canonized as Mishnah, which provides the backbone of the Talmud, by the way, the same 6 orders, not all, but the tractates. And then the Talmud is the Mishnah plus its elaboration over the next 4 or 5 or 6 centuries beyond the Mishnah. So you read a page of Talmud, Mishnah in the middle, and then the Talmudic commentary kind of grows like rings of an onion around it. The closer you are to the margins, the nearer you are to the present moment. The closer you are to the middle, the further back in time you go. That's how you read Talmud. Okay. It's weird when you're doing it like on a digital screen here. You don't get the feel of opening a book of Talmud and really studying it and seeing how it's laid out like those concentric circles of an onion, or squares, because it's text. But that's the idea. Rabbi Meir says the book of Ecclesiastes also does not render the hands ritually impure, as it was not accorded the sanctity of sacred scrolls. All right, so now you have Rabbi Meir who jumps in from, we're going back in time. So the voice of Rabbi Meir is called up from this extra text called the Baraita, which happens all the time in the Talmud. They find all of these baraitot and say, wait a minute, Esther is not unique in this regard. You have other scrolls of dubious divine inspiration, right? And remember, the key is that if it renders the handler impure, it must be a holy book. If it does not, then maybe it wasn't inspired by God. So the book of Ecclesiastes, which is kind of like wise sayings, you know the book of Ecclesiastes, even if you don't think you know it. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted. That's its most famous lines, but there are others that you surely know. Everything is vanity. Everything is the pursuit of vanity and wind. It's this very kind of, I call it gently cynical book. And yet it has some positive affirmations that you can still have a life of meaning, even in this world where there's nothing new under the sun, which is in the first stanza of the book. And the book of Ecclesiastes, by the way, is one of the handful of books, 3, I believe, attributed to the wisest king in all of Jewish tradition. Anyone know his name? In Hebrew, Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. King Solomon the Wise is the putative author of the book of Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, and the Song of Songs. 3 books in Solomon's name. So he says, the book of Ecclesiastes doesn't render the hands impure because it was not accorded the sanctity of sacred scrolls. That's Steinsaltz's gloss. However, there is a dispute with regard to whether or not the Song of Songs renders the hands impure. Also, one of these books attributed to Solomon. Now, Solomon was very wise, but that doesn't mean that everything the man said was divinely inspired. Rabbi Yossi says, the Song of Songs does render the hands ritually impure, but there's a dispute with regard to the book of Ecclesiastes. Again, remember, this is a refresher class on how the Talmud talks. You're seeing it right now. Just one dispute after another, and the Talmud does not seem particularly interested in resolving the dispute. Yeah, well, here's a different rabbi's opinion. Rabbi Shimon says, the ruling with regard to Ecclesiastes is actually among the leniencies of Beit Shammai and among the stringencies of Beit Hillel. This requires another minute of unpacking. Those of you who've been studying Talmud for a while remember that the 2 great academies of early proto-rabbinic thought are called Hillel and Shammai. There probably were actual guys named Hillel and Shammai, though generally when the words are used in the Talmud, it means the academy or the teachings of the Academy of Hillel and the teachings of the Academy of Shammai. 99.9% of the time, Shammai is the more stringent. He's kind of a hard ass. And Hillel is more open and embracing. And there's all of these, not just teachings, but there's lots of folklore about Hillel and Shammai, the men, and their disciples that testify to these attributes, right? That Shammai was tough and Hillel was more like, well, let's make it easier for the Jewish people to follow XYZ law. And 97% of the time, Shammai does not prevail in his argument, which is why Hillel ends up with his name on all the college campuses, right? Nobody says at Penn, hey, there's a lot of anti-Semitism here. Let us seek comfort over Shabbat dinner at the Shammai house. Right? It's okay, so you know that. So you have Hillel and Shammai. And what the Talmud is saying here is we actually have one of the very, very rare examples where Shammai appears to be more, Hillel appears to be more stringent than Shammai. That's what he's saying. Because according to Beit Hillel, the book of Ecclesiastes does render the hands impure, but according to Beit Shammai, it does not, which would be a more restrictive position, though I think that to call that a stringency is a stretch, in my view. All right. However, everyone agrees that the books of Ruth, the Song of Songs, and Esther do render the hands ritually impure. In other words, according to this early Baraita, there's actually no debate about Ruth, Esther, and even the Song of Songs, which is filled with erotic poetry. And the reason being that the whole thing Akiva said, who's a very early sage of the rabbinic community, very, very late 1st century, early 2nd century. Akiva said, the Song of Songs is not just holy, it's the holiest of all the books, because the erotic metaphor of love between a man and a woman is actually an encoded way of talking about the love between God and the Jewish people. So throughout the weeks leading up to and during Pesach, it's customary in many Jewish communities on Friday nights to recite verses from the Song of Songs. One, because the book is set in springtime, everything's blossoming, people are shedding their clothes, they're kind of randy, they're going out and finding mates. And more to the point, it's a story of divine love for the Jewish people and Jewish love for the divine, which results in our liberation from bondage. So the whole thing is a spiritual metaphor for the Jewish experience in erotic terms, which is kind of crazy, but not unfamiliar to anyone who's come to Friday night services. How many of you have ever sung Lecha Dodi? And I've said from the Bima, it's wedding imagery. The idea is that for 24 hours, the Jewish people and the Sabbath are married, and married is usually a euphemism for sexually conjoined, right? There's some kind of congress between the Israelites and God, or in the case of Lecha Dodi, between the Jews and the Sabbath. We are bound together in the most intimate way possible. Okay. Therefore, the argument goes, we would definitely include the Song of Songs as divine writ, and Ruth, and this text says Esther. And in fact, it says there's really no controversy here. Beyond the shadow of a doubt, they're all holy writ. The Gemara answers, it was Shmuel who stated his opinion in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehoshua, saying, no, Shmuel actually has reason to believe that the book of Esther was not divinely inspired. Okay. And you can see it goes on and on and on to defend this case. And what it basically goes on to say is, well, let's read it. It is taught in a Baraita. So again, early text. Rabbi Shimon ben Manasseh says, the book of Ecclesiastes does not render the hands richly impure because it is the wisdom of Solomon. A guy wrote it. It was not divinely inspired. So this guy, Shimon ben Manasseh, a noted sage, but not one of the greats, he says, wait a minute. But these books, I'm sorry, God didn't write them. God didn't even inspire them. Just Solomon, who's a very wise king, he did. But it shouldn't be at the same level as all the other books of the Bible. And when it says they said to him, that means the rabbinic community, the other rabbis, said, no, it was certainly divinely inspired. And that is the reason the book of Ecclesiastes was added to the canon. Some of this is just really a rhetorical argument. It's all rhetorical because all of these books are actually in the Bible that the rabbis have. There is no doubt that at the end of the day, the rabbis will count Esther, Ecclesiastes, Ruth, Song of Songs, all as divine writ. But remember where we began today. How does Purim get to be a holiday? And how does the Scroll of Esther get to be the scroll par excellence that Jews read? And even when we think of the word Megillah, which just means a scroll, Esther is the scroll par excellence. It is the model for how Torah is read and not the other way around. So all the customs pertaining to the public reading of Torah, as I said at the very beginning of today's lesson, come from this tractate. So Megillah is really important. So again, this is all kind of a hypothetical debate. Okay, so how do we solve this debate between Shimon ben Manasseh, who says Ecclesiastes was just written by Solomon, it's not divine, and the rabbi said, no, it was divine, was it this alone that Solomon said? In other words, wait a minute. Wasn't it already stated he spoke 3,000 proverbs? So of the many qualities of the wise King Solomon, brevity was not one of them. We rabbis can relate. We have a lot to say. We had a lot to say. He had 3,000 proverbs. And the argument here is going to be only the ones that were divinely inspired ended up in the book itself, right? He was the kind of guy who could hold forth from his throne room and spout off brilliant proverbs, but only the ones that really were God's wisdom got canonized into a scroll. Follow the logic here? This is a refresher on how, if you don't get this, good, you're in good company. But this is how the Talmud argues. This is how Talmudic arguments are constructed or deconstructed. And his poems were 1,005. So he wrote poems and he had proverbs. Solomon spoke many proverbs, but only a portion of them were canonized in the Bible. That's the point we want to make. Apparently, what is unique about those in Ecclesiastes is that they were divinely inspired. And it even says in the book of Proverbs, add you not unto his words. In other words, these, the ones that got written down, those are the authentic God-inspired text. Similar to what New Testament publishers do. If you buy a standard Bible with New Testament at like your local Barnes and Noble, most of them have words in the New Testament that are in red ink. Funny aside, you remember the old Machzor, the old Jewish high holiday prayer book, Gates of Repentance, the maroon book? And that sometimes you would get ones with red lettering, which indicated the passages that were read on Shabbat and only on Shabbat, when Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur fall on a Shabbat. I have a friend who calls those the Szechuan menu. You have to get the reference, but you ever pick up one of those old Chinese menus? The Szechuan, the spicy dishes were in red. These days, they just use hot peppers because nobody wants to spring for 2 colors of ink. Okay, but that's how you know. So that's not what it literally means. In a New Testament, the red ink are the words that Jesus authentically said. According to what? According to church tradition. There's no extra textual or archaeological evidence that tells us exactly what Jesus said. But according to Christian tradition, certain words are authentically Jesus's. Others, as Tevi would say, it's tradition. So this is where we have to conclude for today. We didn't get to drinking too much, and you have to come back next week. There is such a fun and crazy passage about drinking too much on Purim. We didn't get to shlachmanas or shalachmanot, which means sending out your portions of food as one of the mitzvot of Purim. We didn't get to matnot le'avyonim, which means portions for the poor. So you would send out gifts for the poor. There are 4 mitzvot associated with Purim. To hear the Megillah read, so likro or lishmoa Megillah. Sorry, it put a little hand up there. Okay, 1, to read Megillah or to hear Megillah. 2, to send out portions celebrating the holiday. 3, to give gifts to the poor. And 4, to drink so much, as Anne said earlier, that you can't tell the difference between Baruch Mordechai and Aror Haman, between blessed be Mordechai and cursed be Haman. So next time we're going to continue with Megillah chapter 7, Tractate Megillah, page 7, and read further on. And again, today was a kind of a refresher course on how does Talmud talk? How does Talmud think? What do the rabbis care about? And again, I want to highlight just by recapping the astonishing idea that even the rabbis are open to a debate about which books of their scripture were actually God's words. I mean, that's a quite astonishing comment. And that if the Jewish people can have an argument over, is all of this God's? Is some of it God's? Like, that's a fascinating comment on how Judaism functions. I'm not an expert in world religions. I'm an expert-ish in Judaism. But in all of my studies of other traditions, because I don't think there's any way to understand Judaism without understanding the wider context of civilizations in which Jews have found themselves, in all of my conversations with other religions, it does not seem that any tradition that actually talks about God writing books, and there are many, Islam and Christianity in particular, none of them have this tradition of second guessing which books of their own scripture were actually God's words. And that's something to hold on to and contemplate as we go into this week past Purim. We have so many wonderful things coming up at WRT. I always use a minute or two to share a little bit of good and welfare. I hope that in person, or if you're not able, then remotely, you will join us for a very celebratory and very musical Shabbat service this Friday, beginning at 6:15, as we always do, where we will celebrate the installation of Cantor Isaac Sonnet Asor. Not 1, not 2, but 3 wonderful cantors are coming to install him. Isaac just couldn't choose among his favorite mentors, so Cantor Benji Ellen Schiller, Cantor Richard Cohn, and Cantor Gerald Cohen are all with us this weekend. The music is going to be glorious, plus our own in-house team of cantors and instrumentalists. It's going to be spectacular. And stick around for a Shabbat in the Round on Saturday morning, where Cantor Benjiel and Schiller will share music and wisdom, and we'll all be sitting together. It's all ages, all are welcome. I really hope you'll be there. It's an informal service. You don't need to dress up for it. It's just going to be beautiful. So I'll wish you an early Shabbat Shalom and a late Chag Sameach on Purim, and can't wait to see you next Thursday.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you very much. Everyone stay well.
Shabbat Shalom.
Bye, guys.
Shabbat Shalom, John.
Thank you.
Take care.